Good morning, everyone. This is Jody King with the Alaska Apex Accelerator, and I want to welcome everyone joining us for today's webinar on CMMC Level 1 Process, Pitfalls, and Practical Steps to Success. And it's not just me, everybody, that you have to listen to. We have two amazing presenters from Stratus Services joining us today. We have Owen Phillips and Joel Ricane, who are absolutely the experts on this topic, and they've worked hard on this presentation. I'm really excited about it. But before I turn everything over to them, I want to do just a couple of reminders for webinar activity. One, this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be posted on the alaskaapex.org website under training and then under on demand. And I'll send out an email to everybody once that recording is posted. And we usually have it up within a week at the very most of the actual presentation date. So you should be able to see this by next Tuesday, by the 30th. The recording, it will be, like I said, will be on our website. Handouts are available on your GoToWebinar panel. There are two documents, and we have today's slides, plus we also have a spreadsheet so wonderfully provided by Stratus Services, and I'm sure they'll address that during their presentation. If you're unable to download those handouts, you're always welcome to reply to the webinar invitation. At the end, I'll have my contact information as well. You're welcome to reach out to me, and I'll make sure that you receive those handouts. They'll also be posted under the recording, but for those of you that want to get that started sooner rather than later, why wait? So again, you can download under handouts under your GoToWebinar panel, and of course, you're welcome to reply to your email and just request them, and I'll get those sent out. So please ask lots of questions. We've got the experts here giving us this time, so let's take the best advantage of that. There's a couple of different ways we can ask questions. And I know it seems kind of intuitive that we don't want anybody to talk as you log in and are immediately muted, but there's a couple of different ways. First, we do have the Q&A box where you can enter your questions. We are also monitoring the chat, but if you're on a mobile device or just simply don't feel like typing, you can hit that raise hand feature. I'm monitoring the attendee list, and as soon as I see that, I can unmute you. You'll have an open mic, and then you can go ahead and ask those questions. I know sometimes it's easier to vocalize the question than try to get it down in writing. So please get those questions in here. Take advantage of having these experts volunteering their time this morning to get those questions going. So just that in mind. And at this point in time, I am going to make Owen presenter. Give me 2 seconds here, we'll pause. Owen, your presenters, if you want to go ahead and share your screen.
Yeah, I'll do that. Show this window.
Perfect.
We can see the slides all right? Okay.
I see them fine. If you can't see or if there's any issue with audio, again, feel free to raise your hand, let us know. I want to make sure everything's working for everyone.
Yeah.
All right, we are good to go. Owen, Joel, thank you so much for joining us. At this point in time, I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to the experts. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jody. We appreciate it. So I am not the expert today. I'm just helping run the show in the background. Joel is our expert of the day, our senior cybersecurity engineer here at Stratus. I'm Owen Phillips, our marketing director. I will be also monitoring the chat and questions. We kind of pride ourselves on having a very social and gregarious crew here at Stratus. So like Jody said, please do not feel shy about asking questions, even if it's in the middle of the presentation. We would love to answer questions as things are happening. There will also be time at the end for some wrap-up questions if you have any, but we will be monitoring the chat actively, and I'll chime in and get Joel's attention if something comes out that's super pertinent to what's going on. But I'm just going to go ahead and throw it over to Joel, who's going to walk us through CMMC Level 1, and I'm not going to take up any more time. So thank you so much for being here. Oh, Joel, we can't hear you. I think you might still be on mute.
sure was. How's that?
That's much better. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining us, giving us the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics, CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, particularly focusing on level 1 in this talk. As we'll discuss, level 1 requirements are coming very soon. So I wanted to do a talk that was focused on the process, the assessment process, pitfalls, risks associated with it, and then also talk controls and some practical steps for how you actually implement these requirements and how to actually make yourself compliant with the level 1 requirements. So if we go to the next slide, a little bit about us first. So Stratus Services, we're a local Anchorage-based IT cybersecurity consulting company / managed services provider. So we've been very heavily focused on CMMC for a while now. We've been an RPO, which is a registered provider organization, since 2022. That just means we've done some training and met some requirements specific to CMMC that prove that we're qualified for some implementation and gap assessments, things like that. There's a marketplace of organizations like that, RPOs and some others that you can find at the CyberAB website, where credentialed organizations are listed. On staff, we have several RPs, which is a registered practitioner, RPAs, which is a registered practitioner advanced. CCP is a certified CMMC professional. That's a credential on the assessor track. Then actually, as of very recently, so recently we forgot to update the slides, certified CMMC assessor. So not that we're particularly an assessment focused organization, but with consulting and implementation, it's important to know how to look at things from an assessor's perspective. One of our big claims to fame in the CMMC ecosystem is we helped a client up here back in March pass the CMMC Level 2 assessment. So they have a CMMC Level 2 certificate. They got a perfect 110 out of 110. And they're one of the first 85 organizations in the country to achieve that. So we're very proud to have kind of been involved with this from the ground floor. And we are currently going through our own CMMC Level 2 process with the goal of achieving certification this fall, in a couple months now. So very CMMC focused. We'd like to think we know what we're talking about, and hopefully that'll come across in the next hour or so. So if we go to the next slide, we can get started. So CMMC updates. This was going to be a very brief footnote slide, but there were some major happenings in the CMMC world just a few weeks ago. So as I'm sure many of you probably know, you've been or have been aware of CMMC for a while. It's been a long process. There's been 2 different federal regulations working their way through the rulemaking process to kind of create CMMC as a requirement. So last year, the first of those 2 rules, the 32 CFR rule, came out. And that created CMMC as an official ecosystem. So it exists. You can get certified. There's assessors. All of that is happening. It hasn't been required because there's a separate rule, the 48 CFR rule, which is what will allow the DoD to include CMMC requirements in their DFARS contracting clauses. So that's where you got some of this wait and see, kind of head in the sand. Maybe they'll get rid of it, maybe they'll change it approach, which as of a few weeks ago, we know is no longer the case because the 48 CFR rule was finalized. So it was published to the Federal Register with an effective date of November 10th, 2025. So a couple months from now. And essentially that will kick off a 4-phased, 4-year rollout period for CMMC requirements. So for 365 days, starting on November 10th, so until November 10th, 2026, we'll be in phase 1, where CMMC Level 1 will be required for applicable contracts. During that first year, the DoD has said it's not their intention to include CMMC Level 2 requirements, but they did leave themselves a big kind of asterisk on that, saying that they can if they decide to. There's not a lot of clarity on that. No one really knows what that means. The DoD's stated objective is to include those Level 2 third-party certification requirements in the second phase, so a year from this November 10th date. But there is that possibility that they will show up sooner. So just something to be aware of. And kind of keep an eye on, maybe just have some kind of conversation with your government partners, see if you can get any more information on if these requirements are going to be coming sooner. But we do know for sure November 10th, CMMC Level 1 will be in contracts. So if we go to the next slide here. So we're going to kind of talk about CMMC Level 1 across the board. CMMC Level 1 is a set of 15 security requirements that you have to meet if you're going to be handling federal contract information in conjunction with a DoD contract. It's a self-assessment process, so you don't need to bring in a third-party company to assess you. You need to implement the controls, do some type of assessment, and then report your results to the government. So we're going to talk about a couple of the key components to preparing for an assessment. So scoping being probably the most important one. We're going to talk about the assessment process itself and some of the options you have there. And then, like I was saying, we're going to go through the control. So the 15 requirements you need to meet. We're going to talk about those requirements versus the assessment objectives that they will be assessed against. If we go to the next slide here. So this is kind of a high level, step-by-step, what an assessment looks like. So the first step is going to be to define your scope, which we'll talk a little bit more about, but that's defining what the scope of the assessment is, what needs to be assessed, what doesn't need to be assessed, how do you know where you need to apply these requirements, and where you need to prove that they're being met. The second step is to gather evidence. So CMMC Level 1 assessment has a specific process that needs to be followed for it to be done correctly. And a part of that is to gather evidence that proves your implementation of those controls. So we'll go into some more detail about that later, but just know that there's an evidence gathering step to this. After that, you'll document the results. So based on that evidence, you'll look at your requirements and you'll determine if they're met, if they're not met, or if they're not applicable. You'll report those results. So SPURS is a website I'm sure some of you are familiar with. That's where you have to actually upload your CMMC Level 1 self-assessment results to. And then the final step is to save the results. It's very important to retain these. We say here for a year because CMMC Level 1 self-assessments have to be performed each year. So you definitely want to be retaining your assessment results for that time period at least, just in case anyone comes around asking questions about it. You have the proof that you followed the process correctly. Next slide here. We're going to get into scoping a little bit. So scoping is the most important part of this whole process. If you scope incorrectly, you're going to either wind up assessing the wrong assets or potentially not assessing the assets that you need to. So the scoping guidance for CMMC Level 1 is fairly forgiving, particularly compared to as you go to the CMMC Level 2, 3. It gets a lot more complicated and a lot more stringent. It's more complex. There's more rules to it. So for Level 1, you have in-scope assets, specialized assets, and out-of-scope assets. So since this all revolves around FCI or that federal contract information, your in-scope assets are going to be anything that processes, stores, or transmits that FCI. So processes would be if you're working on some file on a computer, it's processing it. If you have a server full of files that's storing and transmitting, is sending those out somewhere else. Specialized assets are assets that do process, store, or transmit FCI, but which aren't capable of meeting all of the requirements. So the examples that the government provides in their scoping guidance are government furnished equipment, IoT devices, operational technology, and test equipment. So what this is saying is that if you do wind up with one of these asset types, there may be FCI on it, but for example, if it's government furnished equipment, if the government gives you a laptop, you're not going to be able to configure that. So you can't configure it to meet the controls, so they're giving you an out there. For IoT devices, IoT devices are very specialized. They're not a full computer all the time, so they don't have the capabilities to run antivirus, for example. So you have an out on that. Operational technology is more of like your manufacturing devices, which may have some type of computer at its core, but very locked down and proprietary. And then test equipment, if you've got a workstation on a test bench that's not really doing anything, then they're not concerned about it. So out of scope is a very broad category for Level 1. It's anything that doesn't process, store, or transmit that FCI. And what's important about this is that it means that you can have devices on your network, which are in scope, and you could have another device still on the network right next to it, which is out of scope. You don't have to do anything to it if it doesn't process, store, or transmit FCI. Really different from like your Level 2, Level 3 requirements where everything on your network needs something done to it. In this case, it's a lot more lenient, gives you a lot more leeway in how you go about things, and you only have to worry specifically about where your FCI is. Some other important things to consider when you're scoping is that so to talk about assets. Assets can be multiple things. It's easy to think of them as your computers, which are their type of technology, they're an asset, but also people, facilities, and external service providers are assets that can be in scope for an assessment. So people, your employees, obviously that kind of makes sense. Facilities, there's physical security requirements in this that we'll go over. So those are going to apply to your office potentially, probably. And then external service providers could be something like a managed service provider, someone who is potentially storing your data, and if they're storing your FCI, they're in scope, or if they're users in your environment or providing some security service, then they're going to be considered an in-scope asset as well. Next slide here. So FCI, so federal contract information. This is what it's all about. This here is the definition for it. It's a little bit broad and vague. And to be honest, federal contract information is a really broad category of information. As you can read here, it's anything generated or for the government or provided by the government under a contract that's not for public release. It's kind of the bottom line, excluding transactional information, so potentially invoicing or billing. That's not necessarily FCI. But outside of that, a lot of things can be FCI. So some examples of this could be things like project schedules or timelines, technical documents that the government gives you, performance standards or specifications, meeting notes, emails discussing specifics of the project. All of this can be FCI if it's something that's a part of this contract that isn't intended for public release. So it's hard to really get more specific than that. And one of the trickier aspects of this is determining what exactly falls into these buckets of information. It gets really complicated at the level 2 level with controlled unclassified information. But federal contract information is a broad enough category that it's pretty safe to assume that it will be a part of every DoD contract. And the DoD themselves, they've released estimates for how many contracts they think will have these level 1 requirements, and it's basically all of them. It's like, forget the exact number, it's many hundreds of thousands. So if you're doing DoD work, you probably are handling this federal contract information, and so it's very likely that you will have these level 1 requirements.
Hey, Joel, there's a great question that just came in from Garrett. And first off, Garrett, thank you for asking. Secondly, Garrett, if Joel does not answer this enough, we have a blog post that we just put up that covers this exactly. But the question is, does the FCI category contain CUI? Which I know is your favorite question of all time.
Yeah. So all CUI is FCI, but not all FCI is CUI, if that makes sense. So CUI is a more specific type of information, but it does all meet the definition of federal contract information because it's not intended for public release. I don't know if that's an adequate answer. If not, yeah, we do have a blog post on this, and feel free to ask more questions. It's a tricky topic, and you can probably stump me if you ask enough questions, but we'll do our best. So on to the assessment process. So system security plan. So this is something that's specifically called out in the assessment guide, which is the DoD has released documentation. I think we'll link to that later in the slides here, but if you look up DoD, CIO, CMMC documentation, you'll find their website with all of it. So in there's an assessment guide that describes this whole process. It specifically discusses system security plans. So system security plan is a high-level document that's sort of an overview of your information security program. It describes your environment, the network diagrams, asset types, kind of everything that's relevant to the controls you have to meet. And then it has a section for all of those controls with whether you're meeting them or not, or if they're not applicable, and then an implementation narrative that describes how you're meeting that control. So this question of if it's required, the short answer is no. And it's stated in the assessment guide that a system security plan isn't required, but is recommended. So there are some pros and cons to this. A system security plan can be a big document that requires a decent amount of effort to write and maintain. It's not as bad at level 1 just because there's only 15 controls instead of 110 or 134 for the other levels, but there is some man hours required there. The flip side of that is that, as you'll see when we get into the controls, you kind of can't get away from some level of documentation and writing for this kind of cybersecurity. There's a lot of controls that require you to define or specify or identify something. And that basically has to be written down on a piece of paper somewhere. So it could be in like access control policies and information security policies, or it could be in your system security plan. It's really 6 of one, half dozen of another. I'm biased towards the system security plan approach. I think it's good to have things formalized in one master document. You know, if you have IT turnover, you can just throw the SSP to the new guys. They can read it, understand what's going on. But it's not required, and you might be able to save some time if you just write some more kind of low-level policies to address things. So really up to you. Third-party assessment versus self-assessment. So this whole process is called a self-assessment, which it can be. The assessment guide specifically talks about the capability to have a third party come in and complete it for you. It's not required like it is for the other levels, which is a good thing because that gets expensive and time consuming. But it can be a good idea to have someone with some more experience come in and perform this for you. So I would say for level one really is a small enough set of controls that it's pretty likely that you have an in-house IT department that can handle this. You do want to make sure this assessment process is followed accurately and that you have, accurate, well-documented results. The government's getting the whole CMMC process is because the government is trying to get away from people playing fast and loose with these requirements, and the DOJ is going after people, probably not in the level one world, but it is important to do this process correctly. If you have an IT team that you think is capable of it, then absolutely have them do the self-assessment. If you're small enough that maybe you don't have a dedicated IT department, or you just think they don't have that compliance-based cybersecurity type experience, then there's plenty of companies out there that would be happy to help you with a third-party assessment. And with how small the control set is, it's not that kind of daunting of a process. And the last thing here is requirements versus assessment objectives. So I'll talk a lot about controls or requirements. Those are the 15 high-level do this type requirements. When you're performing an assessment, there's specific assessment objectives that have to be checked. So each requirement has a subset of assessment objectives, all of which have to be met in order for you to meet that requirement. So it's important to not just read the requirement and go, oh, I think we're doing that, and check it off. There's specific things within that requirement that you have to check, and you have to meet all of them for that requirement to be met. So go to the next slide here. So evidence is a really important part of this. You need to be collecting evidence as a part of your assessment. We have the blurb from the assessment guide here. That's a really kind of core part of all of this NIST security control framework type cybersecurity. You need to be able to prove, it's not just, oh yeah, I think we're doing that. You need something that proves that you're doing that control. So this can be a lot of different things. Screenshots, configuration files. Down below, we talk about assessment criteria and methodology. So you can interview someone, examine something, or test for each of these controls. So examine is really going to relate back to your evidence. It might be you're looking at, oh, well, here's how our firewall is configured, and we dumped out the config file for it, and I can examine that and see that I'm doing what I said I'm doing. You can also interview relevant people or test the control. My preference is towards test. That's kind of the most, it's going to give you the most assurance that you're meeting the control. If you say my antivirus will block this type of file, you go try to run that type of file, and your antivirus blocks it, you know for sure it's happening. Examine might be like looking at your antivirus configuration where it says it's going to block that type of file, which is pretty good evidence, not quite as solid as test, but good. And then interview would be talking to your system administrator who configures that stuff, tells you how it's configured. They're all valid methodologies for assessing a control, but it's really test, examine, interview in terms of how much assurance you're going to get out of it. And then finally, we have our assessment findings here. So for every control, based on that evidence and the assessment criteria and methodology, you'll determine if that control is met, not met, or not applicable. So met and not met, obviously, if you're meeting all the assessment objectives, it's met. If you're not meeting all of them, it's not met. Not applicable. So there's controls that might not be relevant to your environment. I think a good example of this is there's a control related to publicly accessible system. So if you have a server in your environment that someone can access from the outside, there's some special stuff you have to do to it, but maybe you just don't have that. So in that case, that control is not applicable. You can just mark it off and move on to the next one. Nothing left to do there. In the next slide here, so we talked about reporting assessment results. So SPRS and PIEE, I'm sure many of you are familiar with these websites. This is just where you go to input your score. That's how the government, when they want to award you a contract, they'll check SPRS to see that you have your level 1, level 2, what have you, score in there. PIEE is called out because you need an account on there to get into SPRS. We have some resources down here, some how-tos and some of their help pages there. They're kind of classic government websites that aren't the most user-friendly, so you might take some clicking around and some reading to figure out how to sign up and where to go, but there is some good documentation on it if you wind up at that stage of the process. So next slide here. So now we're going to talk about the controls. Controls are broken down into several families. There's 6 of them here for level 1. So access control, identification, authentication, media protection, physical protection. And then these bottom 2 are your more technical system and communication protection and system and information integrity. So go to the next slide here. So this is the, as I was talking about before, the assessment guide, link to it here. Everything I'm going to talk about is in the assessment guide in more detail. All of the requirements and assessment objectives I'm going to talk about are in there. They also, for each one of these controls, have examples and further discussion, which are actually really useful, because as you'll see, some of these controls are hard to interpret. So they include some kind of like narrative text about some examples of a fictional company and how they're doing things, which is actually really good information if you're coming to this fresh and get a little confused. Definitely go to the assessment guide and check out the further discussion sections for these controls. Okay, so requirements versus assessment objectives. Again, I sort of explained that already. This is going to be the format we use to talk about these controls. Requirement on the left, which is one of the 15 high-level security controls, and then the assessment objectives on the right that you need to satisfy to meet that control. So if we go to the next slide, we get started with access control. So here on the left, we have the requirement, limit information system access, blah, 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 authorized users. So essentially what this control is talking about is authorizing 3 different things: users, devices, and processes acting on behalf of authorized users. You have to identify those, and then you have to limit access to your information system to just those authorized things. So I think users and devices are pretty intuitive here. You have your employees, they're your authorized users. You have your devices, they're the computers and servers and whatever else you have that's connected to the system. Processes acting on behalf of authorized users is a little more tricky. This is essentially talking about service accounts. So there's sometimes in the background in your network, there's automated processes happening where your backup server logs into your desktop to back it up. Usually these need to be done with some kind of user account with special privileges. So that's what assessment objective B here is talking about. It's really those service accounts that are doing something behind the scenes. So all of those need to be identified somewhere. This essentially is talking about like a account management database where you list all your users, and a hardware inventory where you list all your devices. One common thing we see here is like we'll get to the authorized users or identified section and someone will like log in and show all the user accounts that exist there. That's not what this is referencing for this first part. Those are your actual users. Your authorized users need to be defined somewhere else so that you can then look at what users actually exist in the system, compare it to the authorized users who are supposed to be there, and then compare them to make sure that only the authorized users actually exist in the information system. Similarly for the processes section and devices. So the bottom section here is about limiting it. This is essentially, as long as you can prove, like the example I gave for users, here's authorized, here's what exists, they match, then you're limiting system access to authorized users. Same thing for processes, they're basically going to be user accounts anyways. Devices, as long as you have a hardware inventory, these devices are allowed, and I can show that that's all that's connected, then you're meeting that control. This one can be more complicated. There's all manner of really fancy technical ways to meet this control that probably aren't going to be cost effective for smaller organizations. They're great security, and if you're bigger, you might know things like port security and 802.1x and network access controls can make this really easy. If you're smaller, you might want to rely on a more manual process where monthly our tech gets on to the network device and looks at all the devices connected, make sure it matches this list of authorized devices, and that way we know we're limiting. So there's, as you'll see with all these, there's a lot of different ways you can come at these controls, and different approaches are going to make a different amount of sense depending on the size, budget, experience level of your organization. The next control here, so still in the access control family, transaction and function control. So this control is really getting at role-based access control and least privilege. So the first determination statement A here, what it's asking you to do, and this is our first defined requirement. So it's asking you somewhere to define the types of transactions and functions that your users can do. What this means is, or the goal of this is to make sure that your users can only do the things that they need to do to complete their job. This is a pretty like foundational security principle, so that if an account is compromised, it doesn't have more access that it needs. But in order to limit access to, the bare essentials, you need to define what those bare essentials are. This can mean a lot of different things. For small organizations, you might just have standard users and privileged users, and standard users can do word processing, email, and web browsing, and privileged users can configure things. It can be more complicated. Maybe you're big enough, you have an HR department, they can access the HR systems, but your engineering department can't, and the HR guys can't access the engineering tools. So you really have to base it on your organization, what your users need to do, define it, and then configure your system to limit your users to that access. So that type of configuration is pretty common these days. Basically, every system has some way to assign roles and permissions to control what users can do. It's pretty standard for any IT department or company to do that kind of work. This is a little more specific, where you need to be defining a specific set of permissions and only granting those. But it's definitely the kind of thing that's within the wheelhouse of a lot of folks out there. So yeah, and here with the defined, this could be done in an access control policy. It could be done in your SSP. It's really up to you how you want to approach it. Next control here. So this is a weird one. Verify connections to and use of external information systems. So to break this one down, so it's going to talk about external systems. This is basically anything that you use that you put FCI on that isn't under your control. So this could be you have some client that has a file server in their network and you need to drop off FCI files there. Could be a cloud service provider. It could be a BYOD device. If your employee brings in his laptop from home, you don't have control over that. Those are going to be your external systems. Then you'll see everything. There's kind of two sets of controls here that are almost identical. One is for connections to, and one is the use of external systems. So the way I interpret, kind of the best way to think about this is connections to is going to refer to some kind of persistent ongoing connection. So your server has a 24/7, tunnel to some other external system. And use of is like the temporary use. Your employee logs into something, puts FCI there, does something with it, and then logs out. So the identified section of this is just asking you to specify what those systems are. You need to know we're putting FCI in this cloud service provider. We have this subcontractor that we send it to. Controlled and limited just means you're somehow restricting people to only putting FCI in those locations. This one you can do very technically. I think the easier way to do it is through something like a user agreement where you've identified where you're putting this information. So everyone signs a sensitive information agreement that says we'll only put FCI in those locations. Verified is a little more complicated in this context. It's essentially talking about having assurance of some level of security on those systems. Since you're putting FCI there and you can't configure it, how do you know that it's secure enough to put that data there? There's a lot of different ways to go about this. Cloud service providers have all sorts of security certifications and credentials, SOC 2, PCI, HIPAA, something like that could be sufficient. If it's a client you work with, maybe you inquire about their CMMC status, you know, that you need level 1 for this data, for this contract. So have you completed it, get some kind of assurance from them, but you need to somehow make sure that that external system has had some due diligence done to it to determine if it's secure enough for your FCI or not. So it's a little bit tricky, but you just have to figure out some way to get that assurance. Next control here. This is, I've found, people's least favorite control. So control information posted on publicly accessible information systems. So this control is talking about your website, your LinkedIn, Facebook, anywhere that you post information, updates about your company, blog posts, etc. That any random person on the internet can get to. If it's behind like a login page, it's not publicly accessible. If it's internal and only your employees go to it, not publicly accessible. It's really just those LinkedIn, Facebook, website type systems. So what this control is requiring you to do is essentially make sure you don't accidentally post FCI out there. So the steps to it are, you need to identify who's allowed to post that information. So you say, oh, our HR or our marketing department has XYZ person in it, they're allowed to post. You need some kind of procedure in place to make sure that you don't post that FCI out there. You need a review process in place prior to posting something. So, okay, we're going to post something. John is going to post it, so Steve has to look at it before he does it. You know, a second set of eyes on it, something like that. You need a process to review your website. So annually, we go through everything we've posted in the last year and make sure there's no FCI out there. And then you need some type of mechanism to remove it if you do accidentally post it. That doesn't have to be that complicated. You know, if it's out there, we delete it. Maybe we have to contact our website, whoever hosts our website, have them take it down. But some way to ensure that the improperly posted FCI gets removed. The next control here. So this is one of our first kind of repetitive controls. There's a lot of overlap in here, part of what makes it confusing. So this, if you look on the right, looks very similar to that first control with the users, processes acting on behalf of users and devices, saying to identify them, which seems like it's the same thing as identifying our authorized users. And in some ways it is, but really what this is getting at is kind of two things, like having a standardized naming convention and not duplicating usernames or device identifiers. It's asking you to make sure that if you look and you see user J Smith did something in the logs of some system, that you know who that is. And so if you have two J Smiths out there, which is kind of a bad example, most systems won't let you do that with usernames, but like with devices, you could accidentally name two devices the same thing. And then when you see in the logs that a device did something, you don't know which it is, you haven't properly identified it. So if you have some type of standardized naming convention, and then you have your hardware inventory where you track your authorized devices, you can match that up to the device when you see it on the network, then that is you identifying your devices, users, and processes acting on behalf of users. And it's really the devices part of this one that gets tricky. Users and processes, like I was saying, you're kind of going to be forced to uniquely identify them for the most part. So it's really devices you want to be careful with there, but just have a naming convention, make sure that you don't give out duplicate names, and you're pretty much good to go on this one. So authentication. So it's a requirement for, again, for your users, processes, and devices to authenticate or verify them prior to getting system access. So this one is again a no-brainer for users and processes acting on behalf of users. I would hope everyone at least needs a username or password to log into their computer. That is authentication. As long as you're doing that, you're good to go. Processes, this one gets more technical, but they're always going to have a password assigned to them, so you're pretty much good to go there. Devices can get trickier, so it says authenticated or verified, which is important for devices because device authentication is a complicated thing. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Again, technical, potentially expensive, potentially complicated, but verified is different than authenticated. Verified means you don't need a username and password or PKIs and certificates. Verified means someone's checking it. It doesn't have to fully authenticate. So an easy way to do this one is, since you already have your hardware inventory and know what your authorized devices are, some type of procedure for your techs, for example, to check, before you just go throw a new computer out on the network, check to make sure that it's an authorized device and that it's been named properly in accordance with the previous control. So it can be met procedurally, and it'll save you a lot of time and money over a more complicated technical configuration. Not that there's anything wrong with the technical one, and if you're a bigger company, that's definitely something worth thinking about. Might make the whole thing easier. But just if you're a smaller company, don't be afraid to rely on a manual process if that's the best way for you to meet that control. Okay.
I'm checking in on you, Joel. I just want to make sure that you have a chance to take a drink and remind people that we are welcome to take any questions that you might have in the middle of this talk, not necessarily just at the end. So feel free for anybody. I've seen a couple people ping in here later into the talk. So this is an open dialogue. If you have questions while Joel is going over stuff, please don't hesitate. So I hope you got to take a drink, Joel, if you're good to keep going.
Yeah, just snuck one in. Yeah, definitely feel free. We're about halfway through the controls. This can be a little bit grindy. It's just the nature of the material. But I think it's good information for people to have, but definitely don't be afraid to throw in a question there and break things up. So the next one, media disposal. So this one's pretty straightforward. If you have a computer that has this sensitive FCI on it, how do you know that when you're done with that computer, you're not just chucking it in the dumpster and anyone could come by and pull it out and steal the data? So you need a process in place to sanitize or destroy system media, so hard drives. Basically just going to be hard drives, but any system media containing that data needs to be sanitized or destroyed before it's disposed of or reused. So there's a lot of different ways to meet this. There's a specific NIST publication out there, 888, NIST Special Publication 888, that's kind of the government's guidelines for sanitizing and destroying media. So that's a good place to check. There's a lot of different ways to do it. You can always rely on physical destruction. A lot of times that's the easiest way. You can smash it with a hammer. That's destruction. It's going to depend. If you're disposing of it, that's fine. If you want to reuse it, then you're going to have to find, use, there's various tools that can wipe the data and sanitize it while leaving that system media reusable. So you just need to pick what your preferred approach to it's going to be. And that SP 888 is where you're going to find the guidelines on that. The next control here, this gets into the physical security requirements, which are kind of their own beast here. So the first one is all about limiting physical access. So you need to identify your authorized individuals who are allowed physical access. And so this physical access is going to refer to essentially your office. If you have a bunch of computers that need CMMC Level 1 because they have FCI, then your physical facility that houses those is where you're going to have to apply these physical security requirements. So you need to know who's allowed access. That's fairly easy. All your employees probably are going to need it. There are kind of edge cases to account for, like we've seen if you lease your office space, maybe there's a landlord who's got keys and he comes in after hours to do things. There's nothing to say he can't do that, but he has physical access to this environment. You need to be aware of that and track it somewhere. The rest of these controls have physical access to organizational systems, equipment, and operating environment. That's really all for most people referencing the same thing. Your organizational systems are going to be in your operating environment when also your equipment's going to be there. If you have a more complicated physical like facility layout, then you have to think more about these. But for most people, it's your office. You're controlling access to your office where the computers are. The next control, still in the physical security family. So visitors have to be escorted and monitored. These are kind of the same thing. You need to escort a visitor when they come in, so someone's going to have to stay with them the whole time. That can be your monitoring. Other ways to meet this control are like having cameras in the facility. One of the things the assessment guide calls out specifically is having visitor badges. That's a good way to show that you know they're being monitored, because anyone who comes by is going to see the visitor badge on them and know, okay, that's a visitor. But really just having them sign in escorting them, staying with them the whole time is going to meet the first two assessment objectives here. The rest of these are kind of the trickiest component of physical access. So audit logs of physical access are maintained. This one is really awkward for a lot of people. If you have like a nice fancy badging system, everyone's got their little picture badge and there's a badge reader that unlocks the door, then you're probably good because those things all maintain audit logs. Every time someone badges in, there's a log of their physical access. If you're not doing that, it really comes down to having something like a sign-in sheet, which people hate. It is really awkward. Like now an employee has to sign in every time they come into work. That's essentially what this control is saying. Obviously, that's not a great way to meet it. Badging systems can be really expensive, so that's difficult for a lot of people. It's a pretty burdensome control, to be honest, and there's not, or at least we haven't found a really good way to meet that without some annoying effort on people's part or an expensive system to do it automatically. Physical access devices are the rest of the controls here. So that's going to refer to, if you have a badging system, the badges. If you're lock and key, that your keys are physical access devices. And what you have to do here is identify, control, and manage them. So identified, know what they are, have them tracked somewhere, put a sticker with a serial number on it is a great way to do it, and then track them in a spreadsheet. Controlled and managed basically comes down to who has them. We give them to our managers. So we're controlling them by only giving them to some people. And part of our out processing checklist is we check if you have keys and we take them back if you do. That's managed. So not hard controls to meet, a lot easier if you have some kind of automated system, but can be done with old school lock and key type physical security as well. Okay, the next set of controls here are more technical ones. So my favorite, I'll try not to get too in the weeds on them. This first one all revolves around boundary protection. So it's going to talk about two things here, an external system boundary and key internal system boundaries. Your external boundary is if you have a corporate network, you almost certainly, hopefully, have a firewall at the edge of it. That's your system boundary. That's what separates you from the internet, keeps the bad guys out and the good guys in. Key internal system boundaries aren't going to be present probably in a lot of people's environments. That could be some type of internal segmentation due to a lot of different things, really. Like one more common one for smaller organizations might be you put all your IoT devices on a separate segment of your network. IoT devices have particular security concerns around on them. So maybe you isolate them and give them the minimum access out of that network segment that they need. That could be a key internal system boundary. It can get a lot more complicated in bigger organizations. And then with a lot of smaller organizations, it probably doesn't exist. And that's going to make all the key internal system boundary parts of this control not applicable for you. So after that, so for these external and key internal system boundaries, you need to monitor, control, and protect communications. So monitor is kind of straightforward. Most firewall type devices are going to have some sort of logging and alerting in it. So that's just going to be happening. An important aspect of that is, and something we see a lot, is just having that feature turned on doesn't constitute monitoring. If no one is ever logging in to look at it, or you don't have the alerts set up to forward an email to your help desk, something like that, then you're not really monitoring those communications. It's just happening in the background. So some type of we do our weekly checks where we get on the firewall and see what's happened, or every time an alert goes off, it shoots us a notification. That constitutes monitoring. Controlling is really going to happen by default at least at your external system boundary. That's the purpose of a firewall. You have it configured to block all traffic by default, and then you only allow through the traffic that you want. That's controlling. If you have a firewall, you're almost certainly meeting this requirement because it is inherently controlling that communication. If you do have key internal system boundaries, it could be a little more complicated. If you have key internal system boundaries, you probably have a pretty technically savvy IT department that's going to know what this means. There's going to be something similar where at that boundary, you're doing some kind of blocking and allowing. Protected can mean a lot of different things in this context for these last two. It can mean encryption. It could mean you have intrusion detection and prevention systems running on your firewall. It could mean you're doing SSL decryption and packet inspection to look at the packets that are coming through that firewall. It's really, this one is really going to depend on how your network is architected. If you do some research, if you're on your own with this, I'd do some research on your firewall, what capabilities it has, go in and see what's turned on. There's probably going to be something happening that you could say constitutes protection, but it is going to depend a lot depending on what technology is present in the environment. The next control, this one's probably going to be not applicable for a lot of people. This is that publicly accessible system component. So probably the most common version of this we see is you might have like a file transfer server on your network. When people need to get you files, you give them the link, they can log into it, pick something up or drop something off. That would be considered a publicly accessible system. There's other versions of this, but essentially if you just think of it as if someone not in your organization can log into it and it's on your network, that's publicly accessible. If you do have those, the requirement is just to isolate those physically or logically, probably logically. But that just means having it not on your main network, because then that publicly accessible system is exposed to everything. If it gets compromised, your whole network is. So you're required to have it isolated from your main network so that in the event that it has some type of compromise, it doesn't have direct access to the whole rest of your network. Next one here, this is vulnerability management. So you need to be doing some type of scanning and patching on your systems. A lot of different ways, a lot of different tools out there that do this. You do have to be pretty specific in it. So you need to identify like specific kind of SLAs we need to scan every week. We need to patch things within X time frame. You know, if it's a critical vulnerability, it has to be patched that day. If it's medium, next week. You need to have some intentionality with that and really define what you're doing, and then make sure that you are actually patching things, remediating flaws in accordance with those timelines that you've specified. There's, like I said, there's a lot of tools to do this. You can also, there's publicly accessible resources out there. If you look up the CVE program is a kind of open source, publicly accessible list of vulnerabilities. You can manually check for these if you don't want to pay for a more expensive tool. This is one that's a lot easier with a nice fancy tool, but there definitely are more kind of budget oriented ways to get at it. The next one here, I think the last three are all related to antivirus. So you're going to need some form of antivirus, and you're going to need to designate locations where it has to be. This should be all of your workstations, ideally. I think most people are probably doing that already. So you just need to say, this is where we need antivirus running. And then you need to actually provide that antivirus at those locations. So this one is essentially just have it installed. And if you're, a lot of people are going to be in like the Microsoft cloud or something, you can get Defender licensing for pretty cheap if you don't already have something. And there's a million other third-party products out there that'll give you some kind of malicious code protection. The next two requirements here are referencing how it's configured. So this one is saying that your antivirus needs to be configured to update anytime new releases are available. So this is like the antivirus provider is in the background doing research, looking at new malware that's out, virus signatures, and then they're periodically going to push those out to your antivirus so that it stays up to date. You need to have yours configured to anytime one of those new releases comes out, it updates. This is to avoid, having it set up but not updating, and then 6 months from now, all of its threat intelligence is massively out of date and it's not really providing you any protection anymore. Most antivirus does this by default, but you definitely want to check and make sure that it's happening. And then this last one here, final control. So the frequency for malicious code scans is defined. So you need to say our antivirus is going to do a scan every day, every hour, every week. Week would be a long time, usually like some number of hours. You need to define that. You need to configure your antivirus to actually perform that scan. And then the last one is you need to configure your antivirus to scan files that come from external sources when it's downloaded, opened, or executed. So it can be any of those, downloaded as you're downloading the file, when you open it, or when it actually runs whatever that file is. You can pick whichever one of those you want to do. A lot of antivirus is going to let you scan on all of those. So you just need to make sure that you're doing it. And then that is all of the controls. Hopefully that wasn't too much information. So this last section, some of the pitfalls, the really big things we've seen get people in trouble is improper scoping. So if you scope wrong, you could do the world's best assessment afterwards, and it doesn't count for anything because you haven't assessed the right things. It's really important to understand your IT environment and make sure that you've defined that assessment scope properly. Misinterpreting requirements is really common. As you may have seen going through this, there's a lot of words, there's always semantics when it comes to the English language. People think about things differently, have different interpretations of words. It is a skill set and experience that you need to understand what they're referring to here. And if you don't know, to go check the assessment guide and look at the further discussions and guidance in there, you can really get sent off in the wrong direction. I think most people, if you're willing to put in the time and read the assessment guide and like really think it through, I think your average person can correctly interpret these requirements. It might take a while, but they can do it. But you do need to put in that time. And then lack of evidence. So it's easy. Spurs will let you, for level 1, just go in and click yes. You can just go in and say, boom, we're compliant. If you've done that, you have not followed the process that you were supposed to follow. You have to perform an actual assessment, document the results, gather evidence. Evidence being the big one. You really want to have those artifacts on hand to prove you did the assessment properly. And it's not, for level 1, it's not that tedious of a process. It's only 15 controls. You don't need that much evidence. Might take someone a day, but really make sure you've done the due diligence there and have gathered all of that. So finally, we wanted to kind of emphasize, so this talk is all focused on level 1 with the final rule coming out and level 2 on the horizon for people. We just wanted to emphasize that level 1 and level 2 are very different processes. If you do think you have level 1 needs coming at some point, do your level 1 for now, but just know that level 2 is different enough that it can kind of fundamentally change your approach. There's far more controls. The rules for scoping are a lot more complicated. There's like way more asset categories, and these asset categories have different requirements, a lot more difficult. There's particular concerns for cloud service providers. So if you're storing the level 2 data CUI in the cloud somewhere, it needs FedRAMP. So you could be level 1 compliant with all your cloud service providers. When you need to go to level 2, you might need to find new cloud service providers. And it's a lot more technical. The technical control sections are much larger and more difficult. So I guess just not to give a false sense of security around this, level 1, very approachable. Level 2, if you think you're going to need that, it's time to start thinking, or probably it's time to start doing something about it probably, and just know it's a lot more. So I think that's all we had. Here's our contact information. Feel free to reach out. We're always happy to talk about this stuff. And if there's any questions now, we would be happy to address them.
All right, so this is Jody again. For anybody that, if you want to ask questions or kind of have a little bit more in-depth discussion, we do have time. You can just click the raise hand feature on the GoToWebinar, and I'm happy to unmute you. Can make it a lot easier. Yeah. So Owen, do you want to keep doing questions or?
Yeah, one question just came in. I'm fine to keep, so we've factored questions into this thing, so that's why we kept it a crisp hour and knew or figured that people would probably ask questions. But another question from Garrett, what are the 4 phases of the 4-year rollout?
Yeah, that's a great question. So phase 1 is, so all of these phases are 365 calendar days. So they'll all be November 10th year to year. Phase 1 is level 1 requirements for sure. Level 2 self-assessment requirements, which I wouldn't focus too much on. There's some tiny % of contracts that are going to require level 2 self-assessment. I think the DoD has said it's like 1%. It's probably not going to apply to you. And then level 2 certification at their discretion. I don't think that will mean that many, but no one knows for sure. Level 2 will introduce the CMMC Level 2 certification requirements. I'll be honest, Level 3 and 4 are far enough in the future that I kind of forget the details. They have to do with Level 3, which again will only affect a really small percentage of companies. Very unlikely to apply to anyone on this call. And it also affects option years on contracts. I think at some point, option years will start to require CMMC certification, and that is phase 3, I believe, but I would fact check that.
Also, Garrett, I just popped into the chat. There's a DoD kind of little schematic that gives a pretty good overview that we copy and pasted into a video that we did, a podcast that we did recently, because it is confusing, but it gives you a full stair step of the bullet points of the important components that I would recommend taking a peek at. We got a question here from Brian that says, upon achieving level 1 compliance, we understand firms record that in SPRS using a firm's cage code. Oh, I don't know if that's a question or a comment.
That is correct. That is a factual statement.
Okay, we have a question from Brian that says, what has been your experience with how joint ventures use prime partner firm certifications to demonstrate level 1 or higher compliance under JV's cage code?
Yeah, so mostly what we've seen in like the prime sub relationship is people starting to put out feelers into their supply chain to see how seriously they've been taking this, how far along they are. As far as, could you reread the second half of that question again, Ellen?
Yeah, it says for how joint ventures use the prime partners firm certification to demonstrate level 1 or higher under the joint ventures cage code.
Yeah, so with the actual contract clause that enforces these requirements, it flows down to anyone underneath you, any subcontractor you have to pass those requirements on to. In the joint venture world, that's like I guess it's a little bit outside of our wheelhouse from like a business perspective. Most of the people we work with are either a prime with a couple of subs or a sub to a larger prime. I don't think we've dealt with anyone who has a joint venture type situation going on. I just do know that anyone you're passing that contract on to, you'll have to pass the requirements onto as well.
All right, so gentlemen, Pamela Finisad has raised her hand virtually. So I'm going to, Pamela, I'm going to unmute you. Now you have to unmute yourself. It's talk about controls.
Right. Great.
All right, go ahead.
So to follow on with the conversation going on, as a prime, I know that I have to flow down clauses to my subcontractors. What questions, you said some of the larger companies are already doing feelers out. What questions would I be asking for these subcontracts? And if we come across one small business who has no clue, again, what would we help them with? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question and a kind of tricky situation for a lot of people. We've seen questionnaires come out that ask for your current SPRS score. So prior to CMMC, people they were still supposed to implement the requirements, generate a score, submit it to SPRS. So we've seen people just asking for that score, which should, in theory, give you some kind of indication as to how many of the controls they've implemented. The problem with that is, and the reason we have CMMC is a lot of people would just go put in a perfect score. Sometimes, you know, it's just they didn't have experience with this and they looked at the requirements and we're like, yeah, I think we're doing that. I'm sure there's some people who are less honest about it. But so that is a worthwhile question to ask still. If someone has a really negative score, you know they're not doing well. If someone has a perfect 110, that can be suspicious in its own way. Another set of questions to ask would be more specific to CMMC. So are you pursuing level 2? Where are you at? Do you have a POAM? Have you reached out to an assessor? Do you have anything on the books? Have you done a pre-assessment yet? Those would be big ones, like having a pre-assessment done by an actual assessor who's given them a score is a score you can like really rely on. And then for people who are still brand new to it, it's a tough one. If they really are coming to it fresh at this point, it is probably time for them, unless they're really large and have a great IT department, they probably want to reach out to someone for some help. Given the timeline on things, it can take a while to get this stuff implemented. So yeah, I would probably refer them out, tell them to start seeking some external assistance on things.
So I have a question for you, please, Joel.
Mhm.
How often, so the requirement to post a score has been out for a while. I know we've had, level 1, level 2, 1.0, 2.0, as this kind of keeps recycling and resurfacing. How frequently should you update that score? So maybe your first score wasn't so good, but you're genuinely working. I mean, what would you recommend that?
Yeah, so the requirement is annually, or if there's been a significant change to your network. So at least annually, and then significant change is one of those lovely DoD vague terms that they just threw out there, and everyone's like, what does that mean? If you have re-architected your network, if you've replaced all of your servers, if you've fired your IT provider and hired a new one, those are kind of what like a significant change is, seems where the consensus is forming. And then as you progress on your own, you can update it at any time. I think some kind of cadence like quarterly makes sense. If like you're still working up from a negative score, I definitely wouldn't be afraid to update it more frequently to reflect if you're doing good work and improving your score. I wouldn't be afraid to update that. It's really kind of up to you. If you think you're close to being completely done with it, maybe you hold off and just put in that perfect score. If you think it's still going to be a while, you can update it and then wait till you're at the finish line to update it again.
Thank you. That's a good practice to keep in mind. Anyone else want an opportunity to raise hand, ask questions? Brian, you had your hand raised for a little while, Mr. Duffy. Do you want that open mic? Do you want to talk more? Yeah, let me go ahead. Okay, I've unmuted you. Oops, let me try one more time. Sorry. Sometimes, okay, now you're just self-muted. So go ahead and unmute yourself, Brian. Got it.
Hey, Jody, thanks so much. Hey, nothing further here, gentlemen. Thank you very much for your time and expertise today. I apologize for distracting everyone. Thank you.
Oh, no worries.
Oh,
Thank you.
no worries. So the one thing with the joint ventures, because that really is kind of especially in the ANC world, where there are so many joint ventures created, and for you all, gentlemen, that we have those with SBA joint ventures and through mentor protege programs, we have where the joint ventures are either populated or unpopulated. And of course, unpopulated means they're just using the partner's employees versus populated means it has its own employees. And so I would want to kind of clarify, if I have a joint venture that has its own payroll and its own employees, to me, it seems like that should trigger a self-assessment for that joint venture and not just assume that one of the other parent companies is applicable. Does that help kind of clarify the world more for that question?
It does. It's still a little bit new to me, and this is on my list of things to research later today. It all is going to revolve around cage codes. All CMMC things are specific to a cage code. So I guess I don't know if a joint venture has one governing cage code. Oh, okay. Then
it does get its own cage code. It has to be registered in SAM as a separate entity from the two partner companies, and it does get its own cage code.
Okay. In that case, my understanding, CMMC is all the scores are reported based on a cage code specific to that. That does raise an interesting question of like, if you have two CMMC certified organizations who've already paid for their expensive assessment that are now doing a joint venture, would they need a new one for that different cage code? That feels wrong. So I thought I had an answer there and then maybe confused myself more, but it will be specific to a cage code, whatever the cage code for that contract is.
Well, let me throw in, based on what I've heard from you this morning, that depending on where the joint venture is going to be physically housed, where the work's being performed, and if that work's being performed in the majority owner's facility and that CMMC requirements are in place, those factors are in, then it's really about taking that standard operating procedure and writing that for your JV, saying, here's work's going to be performed. We're going to be under this company's internet system. We are then basing it on the internet security protocols implemented by majority owner. Is that a safe assumption? It's about where are we accessing for those employees on that JV? Where are they using the equipment? How are they handling the data?
Yeah, so it'll still come down to where the the data is. So you're right there. It's ultimately going to come down to, if you're handling FCI, where's that FCI going? That's where you'll need to meet these requirements. And so there, I guess it just kind of depends on how the joint venture is structuring that.
Thanks. Sounds like good blog topic, huh?
Yeah.
And did you, if you would, in the chat, put up the link to your blogs for, where do they find that? Feel free to give us that information. So we do have 15 more minutes and we've got some fabulous talent. Do you guys have questions? I know this is being recorded. Sometimes we don't want to use our own example, but if you have a friend in that circumstance, feel free to ask those questions. All right. And I would feel free to check out the blogs and the website for, oh, gentlemen, I know I interrupted myself. We uploaded a spreadsheet, an Excel spreadsheet in the documents. Do you want to pull that up and talk about that at all? What it is, how to use it?
I can pull that up.
You provide it?
Are you prepared, Joel?
I'm prepared. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry, and let me pop
No,
quiz,
you're
gentlemen, pop quiz.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is what Owen's about to pull up is we have our own kind of template assessment form that we use when we're performing the CMMC Level 1 self-assessment for people. It's just kind of like a structured way to log the results for each control and organize things. There's a section to put in a plan of action. So I guess that's something we didn't talk about. If you aren't meeting controls, you want to document those in a plan of action, which is essentially just identifying the control, that it's deficient, and then some write-up of the task that's going to be required to make it compliant. But starting from the beginning here, so there's some basic kind of foundational scoping questions we'd like to go over with people, just to understand the environment and make sure we're accounting for everything. And then over on the next tab is where we have the actual assessment form. So this is all the controls, all those assessment objectives, implementation status, description of the control, and then the date that we marked it met. So this is our internal form we use that we wanted to give out because it helps. I think it really helps to give a structured approach to it where you can document everything and
Absolutely.
yeah, kind of help prevent that just clicking, like reading it and thinking, oh yeah, we're probably doing that and moving on. We just kind of help guide people through the process.
And there's some pretty basic instructions and recommendations at the beginning. It's not necessarily the most comprehensive, but at least give you some guidance of, once again, how we use the form in-house and how you might be able to use it yourself. So that's the overview.
So let me do an impromptu survey of the audience and a quiz to see if everybody can use the GoToWebinar software. Can I see a raised hand from our attendees of those that have done the Level 1 certification? We've got Garrett. So you guys are in the right webinar. Perfect, thank you. Thanks, Garrett. How many of you are now going, oh, I need to get on this now? Can we do a show of hands again? Thanks, Audrey. Yep, honesty, Dave, thank you. Clint, oh, yep. Our to-do list is getting longer. Thank you, I appreciate that. Thank you for that honesty. So gentlemen, let me ask you, and I know this question's a little self-serving, but obviously it's kind of comes down to when should you hire this level of expertise in-house versus bring in those experts and working. So for like the smaller companies that maybe their IT is outsourced, let me rephrase, let me clarify my question. If I'm a small business and I don't have a full-time computer person in-house, maybe I'm the owner and I've been kind of doing it, and I'm thinking, all right, I'm gonna hire someone to be my IT, knowing I'm gonna be in the government contracting and dealing with CMMC. What should I ask my these businesses that I might be contracting? What type of things should I be, how should I qualify? Who should I bring in and pay a fee to for help? Sorry, long-winded question.
No, that's a great question. So one easy one is like the registered provider organizations. Like I mentioned, we are one. There's also many others out there. If you go to the Cyber AB in their marketplace, you can look at all of them. Those are people who have dedicated some time and effort towards specifically CMMC and should have the experience to help people out with that. I would say for level 1, you probably don't need that specifically. That's going to be like a much more sure thing. If your normal commercial IT provider, if they're willing to take this on, is probably capable of it. It does depend on their willingness. You know, there's some new stuff they have to learn and some stuff they're going to have to provide to you. That really changes when you go to level 2. Level 2 makes it far more complicated, and I would really seek out someone who has a lot of specific experience in CMMC.
Thanks. Dave Fetters, I see you have your hand raised. I've unmuted you. You just need to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm gonna get my hand down. My bad.
Well, I can tell you as someone that does presenters, I love it when the audience is like, I want to talk to. Makes it feel like we're connecting, so thank you. Did you have any questions? All right. Well,
we do have a question from Pamela that came in through the Q&A box, and I know that it's one that Joel likes. So can you discuss how many C3PAOs there are, how many have certifications, and how many are waiting to get certified? I know this has been a big topic in the Cyber AB also.
Yeah, so that's a great question. If you do have those level 2 requirements, so right now, I usually know the exact number, but I haven't checked recently. I think it's probably somewhere around 80 C3PAOs. It was in like the mid 60s a while ago. Let me see. We are at 81. Oh, I was close. So there's 81 C3PAOs nationwide. As of right now, it's still like several hundred companies have gotten their level 2. The DoD in the final rule expanded their estimation of how many people will need a level 2 to I think 119,000. So it's still a tiny percentage, and there's still not a lot of assessors out there. So that's something really to consider if you'll think you'll need level 2, is these people, the ones we talk to, are already getting booked out into 2026. So that's a really good thing to be aware of, that there's a bottleneck right now in the ecosystem, and it is mostly assessors. Did that answer the whole question? I forget if there was okay.
And that's a good point too, because looking at your company's strategic plan for growth, if DoD is heavily in your sights as that potential client that whether you already have DoD contracts and you're looking to build more, I think this is going to become more and more defined as all of this becomes more routine. And again, I think there's a little bit of that feeling of, well, they had 1.0 and then they took it back, and now there's this 2.0, and what if they take it back again? So people have been hesitant. I've sat in enough DoD events to know that the Department of Defense absolutely is very, very concerned about the security of data, especially anything related to that warfighter. So I don't think this is ever going to go away. What's your opinion on it?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a one-way ratchet on this stuff. I think it only ever gets more strict. There's already, for CMMC, there's a revised version of the 110 controls that you currently have to implement that they're going to upgrade to at some point, that's even more strict, and it has less controls but is more technical and has more work. Anyways, they already have plans that are probably years off, but to increase the requirements more, and I don't see it ever going backwards.
So just let me have you check your crystal ball. Do you see civilian agencies adopting this once it's kind of stabilized?
Potentially. So there's a broader kind of movement towards 800-171, which is the control set for the whole government. So right now it's the DoD. This whole process started off, it was supposed to be executive branch wide. It was taking too long, and the DoD had these particular concerns. They felt like all their data was getting stolen. So they kind of short-circuited the process and came up with CMMC. That other process is still happening. There's a FAR clause that's similar to CMMC that is still probably years out, but is working its way through that whole process CMMC went through, that is going to require some level of cybersecurity for other agencies, Department of Interior, for all of them essentially. No one knows what that means yet. It probably won't be as stringent as CMMC where you need this third-party assessment, but it's also probably going to vary from agency to agency. Maybe some people will just have reciprocity with CMMC. If you have that, you're good. No one knows yet, but it is spreading.
Thank you. Just kind of, sometimes it's nice to put the, your finger on the pulse of outside of just DoD centric. So, all right, guys, well, we're down to the last, still 10 more minutes. But I will let you know if you guys don't have any questions, if you feel like you have a lot to think about, needs to churn through that gray matter a little bit, and then the questions are hitting fast and furious. Here's the contact information for the gentleman you see on the screen in front of you. And here in just a moment, I'll post the contact information for Alaska Apex. And, let us know. Ask the questions, because one of the things that I talked about for the point of this webinar with Joel and Owen is what happens if you say you did something and you didn't. You have government material and you have a successful, not threat, but I don't know, your software is invaded. I'm sorry, not IT, but something goes bad. What can happen if you said you were covered and you're not?
Yeah, so what can happen is the DOJ comes after you for a False Claims Act suit. If you look up the DOJ Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative, you can find stories on the people they've gone after so far. They are mostly focusing on like really egregious actors, at least at this point, but they're becoming intentionally more litigious about this. And if you violate these contract clauses and bill the government, you are, in their eyes, violating the False Claims Act, which empowers any whistleblower can sue you under that. The DOJ can join it, take over the suit. The whistleblower gets a nice, I think, 30% or 20% portion of the settlement without having to do any work. And that has been happening more and more the past couple of years.
Thanks, because I think there's a fear of something happening and nobody wanting to say anything because they're going to lose a contract or they might get a negative past performance for it. I mean, it's as simple as I opened an email from a client and it had an attachment to click and they asked me to, look at what they had attached, and I clicked on it. Well, it was pure malicious intent and it wasn't from the client, and the document immediately, what did they call it, a spray attack? And so the first thing I did was call IT and say, I think I broke something. So, it's that matter of honest reporting. Do you guys have any comment on that? Not to be afraid to report if something has triggered?
Yeah, so you're required, part of the DFARS clauses that all of this comes from requires you to report any significant breach of your IT system to the government. I think you're contractually obligated to. There was recently a case, I think a company out of Boston that self-reported for something like this, and the DOJ, I forget exactly what happened, how it shook out, but was very lenient on them, as opposed to some of the cases where there was a whistleblower and they came in after the fact. Those people had big 7-8 figure settlements. Whereas the government seems to be a lot more willing, if it's just negligence or some kind of innocent non-compliance that resulted in some type of breach like that, they seem to have a much less aggressive stance on it.
And again, from a conference I sat on from the Department of Defense, their Small Business Week, the goal was to get people to report because they want to capture that information to build this database of how are these attacks being. So they're really wanting that information for proactive use internally at looking at where are our threat levels. So they do welcome that. So please, again, if you have these DoD contracts, you're under these requirements, and you do have those incidents, it's better to report. And if you ever have questions, of course, here's your experts you can reach out to and say, was that or was that not? Does that qualify? Should I do something? Or even reach out to that contracting officer as well.
Yeah.
All right,
absolutely.
guys. Pamela, do you have another question? I see your hand up again.
I just want to make a comment with the breach, because a lot of people now have cybersecurity insurance. And so one of the things, the first things you do is contact them. And I've seen it where then you get a legal person involved right away also. So, but the insurance company can give you advice right away. So that's one of the first places you want to start.
See, that's so funny. You said, oh, people might have cybersecurity insurance. And I'm like, I didn't even know that was a thing. So
Oh, yeah.
It's hard to be in the know all the time. So that was a great point to bring up. Thanks. Yeah, something else for you all to look at too. All right, everyone. Well, I am seeing the official time is 11:26. I'm going to do a last call for questions. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and give these gentlemen a couple of minutes of their life back to them. So if you can't type fast enough, quick raise a hand. All right. And we have lots of thank yous in the question box. Again, don't forget to click on those links in the chat feature so you can save it and look at it. I know we're rolling into that lunch hour too. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today. I really appreciate it. Gentlemen, I appreciate you guys reaching out and volunteering to provide these webinars for us. And I look forward to future activity. I am going to quick steal the screen, and so I can just put up the contact information for our group. Good heavens. You heard me say the word quick,
I was
but
gonna say,
apparently...
yeah, and I was like, I would give it back, but I don't know what button to press to make that happen.
No, that's me. And now we're
Okay.
gonna quick clean off my screen, which I should have done before sharing. All right, what happens when you have too many monitors. But just again, guys, just a reminder, our Alaska Apex is part of a national association. So if you're doing business in other areas, those places of performance, feel free to check out the websites for our national association and the Department of Defense, OSBP, they have theirs. This is their website. Reach out to those other Apex centers, log in, see what they're doing for training and webinar too, especially for that place of performance. And of course, for our team, here we are, a little short staff, but we're here. So again, if you think of something after the fact, you're always welcome to reach out to any of us here at the Alaska Apex. We know how to find these guys too, if need be, and invite them into that conversation if you're looking for their contact information. Last statement, whoops, get that off my shared screen. Don't forget to download those documents. And since I don't see any more questions, I'm going to go ahead and officially close the webinar.